Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today is Christmas Eve, and it's probably no surprise that we'll be covering an all-time holiday horror classic from 1974 that not only became a staple of the genre, but arguably kicked off the entire slasher subgenre in general. It's the story of a group of sorority sisters who, while weathering the snowy holiday season at their university fraternity house, find themselves at the mercy of a maniacal stalker. And while a string of increasingly vulgar and aggressive phone calls to the residents are indeed reported to police, things seem to take a turn for the worst when one of the students goes missing, kicking off a series of violent events that would prove to be just as blood red as Santa's suit. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Black Christmas. It's 1974 during the holiday season in Bedford, Ontario, and over the winter break at a local university, a group of sorority sisters at Pi Kappa Sig are fully embracing the Christmas spirit. Now, this sorority at 6 Belmont Street was inhabited by numerous students at the university, many of whom would tragically end up as victims of alleged stalker and serial killer Peter Smythe, the same sick individual who would later become known as the Sorority Christmas Killer. Now, before we get into the actual murders themselves and the missing persons report that would kickstart the police investigation, the victims of the 1974 killing spree were mostly either residents or staff at Pi Kappa Sig sorority at 6 Belmont Street, which would later become a very prominent crime scene. They include sole surviving female victim Jess Bradford, as well as her numerous friends and cohorts at the university. There's fellow students and sorority sisters Barb Cord, Phyllis Carson, and Claire Harrison, who was actually the first to have been reported missing in the string of brutal crimes. And finally, there was the attending Mac McHenry, the female supervisor and caretaker of the sorority house itself. And while the case would have 2 other murders attributed to the killer, the sorority sisters are considered to be the most prominent and most talked about victims in the case, likely due to the unique circumstances of the crime, as well as the distinct location of the crime scene that no doubt sparked many urban legends and stories among the community in the following years. Now, in what many consider to be an extremely mishandled case from start to finish, which was often attributed to the actions or rather inactions of the highly criticized local law enforcement officer Sergeant Nash, reports of wrongdoings began about a week prior to the no doubt violent murders in the sorority Christmas killings. Police reports indicate that an unnamed female was sexually assaulted while walking from campus nearby. And while she remarkably survived the attack, the assailant was actually never apprehended. And it was around this time that the sorority house at Pi Kappa Sig began to receive a series of explicit and threatening phone calls from an unnamed and unidentified caller that the students jokingly dub the Moaner. And as these calls get progressively more violent in nature, they would culminate in the disappearance of one of the sorority sisters, ultimately setting in motion the series of killings within the confines of the house itself, as well as the police investigation that would end with the death of the infamous Sorority Christmas Killer. Though we'll discuss the theories that seem to conflict with the killer's own identity. Now, subsequent victim statements from survivors and other students present at the time who actually left the residence during the winter break and, as such, avoided these murders entirely, indicate that the women at the sorority had initially assumed that these calls were just harmless pranks, possibly from another fraternity in the area, offering up a series of simply vulgar diatribes. But on this particular evening, in December 1974, this Moaner caller would prove to be more aggressive than usual. The caller allegedly became more and more agitated as the conversation went on, which mostly consisted of his own incoherent ramblings and sexual innuendos that were later recorded by local authorities in subsequent calls to the house, and that this call abruptly ended with a threat of violence towards future victim Barb Cord. In spite of these disturbing calls, the group, and namely Barb herself, initially brush off the call as some perverted individual trying to scare the sorority sisters. However, there was one individual who took the threats rather seriously at the time, and it was that of student Claire Harrison. And as fate would have it, Claire herself would be the subject of a missing persons report a mere few days after the threatening call took place. Claire's father indicated to police that he was scheduled to meet Claire on the campus grounds at around 1 p.m. the day after the sorority Christmas killer called the student residence, and that when his daughter failed to arrive for this meeting, he became increasingly concerned for her well-being. And after a visit to the residence at 6 Belmont Street proves uneventful in locating Claire Harrison, her father grows more and more weary of the supposed disappearance. Now, according to friends and family, it was extremely out of character for Claire to simply disappear, and a search of her room and her belongings at the sorority house revealed that she had already packed her bags to seemingly depart for the holiday season, only she had left the packed bags inside her bedroom at the sorority. A chilling fact that would later show that she actually never left the sorority at all. Now, these turn of events is enough for both Mr. Harrison and supporting friends and future victims Barb and Phyllis to report these concerns to their local police at Bedford Police Department. Station records show that the aforementioned Police Sergeant Nash initially took these complaints and concerns at Bedford Police Station, but ultimately failed to report the missing persons report to leading Lieutenant Detective Ken Fuller. It's argued by many that this failure at the hands of the Bedford Police Department no doubt contributed to the violent progression of the case itself, and that had officers acted sooner, they might have actually prevented many of the ensuing deaths to follow. And in spite of increasing pressure from concerned friends and family, including that of Claire's then-boyfriend Chris Hayden, the investigators don't actually begin to take the disappearance seriously until another tragic and seemingly unrelated crime is discovered, that of the disappearance and murder of another victim in the area identified as local high schooler Janice Quaife. Now, to press pause here for a second, at the time of the sorority Christmas killings, it was assumed that the disappearance of Janice Quaife was not at all connected to the case. Her mother had reported her missing to police after Janice failed to arrive at a band practice at her local high school, and it was highly out of character for Janice to do so without at least some point of contact with her parents. Now, tragically, Janice's body is discovered shortly thereafter during a police and community search in a nearby park where Janice was known to have traveled to and from school. While her cause of death is ultimately unclear in reports, her tragic murder would spark police to formally launch an investigation into the recent threats and subsequent missing persons report at Pi Kappa Sig, now led by responding lead investigator Lieutenant Ken Fuller. And so now it's official. The case is a missing persons report being investigated as a possible homicide. And since the investigation is in full swing, Lieutenant Fuller enlists the assistance of Bill Graham, an associate at the police station, who's able to install a remote phone tap system on the sorority phone lines. Now, this effectively allows the police to monitor any and all phone calls to the house itself, and police are hoping that at this point, if the supposed killer calls back, they can then trace the call to reveal his potential location, and then initiate a subsequent arrest. And as police records and physical recordings as evidence of these calls would reveal, they would prove to only become increasingly more disturbing. While initially the calls themselves were too short to trace, no doubt limited by the technology of 1974, police were actually able to not only listen in, but also record said calls from the killer in question. Recorded police calls with the killer clearly indicate that the individual had some sort of a personality disorder, and actually seemed to slip in and out of each persona at great length during these calls. Now, this included such drastic measures as physically altering his own voice, as though he was speaking as completely different people, both of which were male and female presenting individuals. Now, these voices included named personas, such as the likes of Billy and Agnes, as well as characters simply referred to as mother or father. While the majority of the recorded calls are mostly incoherent, it does seem as though the caller is almost at odds with themselves and their own multiple personalities, almost as if, quite interestingly, they may be actually arguing among one another, offering some fascinating psychological insight into the potential fractured mind of sorority Christmas killer Peter Smythe. And as these calls become more and more frequent, police are actually able to get a proper trace on where the calls are originating from. And famously, the location would prove to be extremely chilling, as these calls were originating from within the residence at 6 Belmont Street, indicating that the caller, and possibly the killer in question, had apparently been hiding within the sorority house itself during the entire duration of the crimes. When police finally respond to the house at 6 Belmont Street, their reported findings are truly gruesome. After hearing a commotion and screams from inside the house, police breach the premises and enter into the basement, where they find the unconscious body of victim Jess Bradford, the sole survivor of the sorority Christmas killings. The bodies of victims Barb Cord and Phyllis Carson are located in the same bedroom on the second floor of the house, where they were both strangely and seemingly deliberately positioned in the bed. While autopsy reports of Phyllis's body are ultimately inconclusive, Barb was determined to have been killed by repeated puncture wounds from a stabbing weapon that blood trace samples later confirmed to be a collectible crystal unicorn ornament that she kept in her room along with other ornaments at the time the murders took place. Now, victim Barbara McHenry, who was also discovered at the residence, was expected at her sister's for a Christmas gathering, but ultimately failed to appear at the event, which was considered highly out of character. Her body was later recovered from the sorority house at 6 Belmont, where she was found hung from a hook and pulley system on the wooden support structures within the attic of the property itself. Her cause of death was likely a combination of shock and massive blood loss, as the hook in question forcibly entered her neck and penetrated her inner jaw before ultimately suspending her in the air. Now, massive blood loss patterns at the scene indicate that she likely bled out as a result of these wounds. The body of the next victim is that of fellow sorority sister and missing person Claire Harrison, who was also discovered in the attic of the property at the Pi Kappa Sig sorority house. She had been murdered via asphyxiation at the hands of a plastic clothing bag that was found to disturbingly still be secured around her entire head. Like other victims in the house, her body itself was seemingly deliberately positioned in a rocking chair next to the attic window. Now, this is the same window that it was assumed by police that the killer had used to enter the premises some days prior, where he infiltrated the sorority undetected and likely remained in the attic during the period of the murders. Time of death records indicate that Claire was likely killed the very same night that she disappeared, and that her body had, in fact, likely been in the attic of the property during the entirety of the subsequent investigation into her own disappearance and possible murder. A fifth victim is also located outside the property itself and is identified as local Bedford police officer Jennings. He was found to have been killed via blood loss from a single deep laceration to his throat, which seemed to be the result of a slash from a sharp object that was never actually formally located. The final body recovered from the crime scene at the Pi Kappa Sig sorority house was also located in the basement, and it was none other than alleged serial killer Peter Smythe, who most notably was killed at the hands of surviving victim Jess Bradford. Now, to add some much-needed context to the background and the identity of this now infamous serial killer, Peter Smythe was actually a student at the university and was romantically involved with victim Jess Bradford at the time of these sorority Christmas killings. Police began to suspect Smythe as a person of interest in the case when it was discovered that he not only appeared at the crime scene at 6 Belmont Street numerous times, but that he had also had an increasingly turbulent relationship with Jess herself at the time the murders took place. In statements that were later corroborated by Jess Bradford herself, Peter had been under increased pressure at school, namely in a crucial grading of a final piano performance for his musical theory class, in which he was hoping to graduate. In addition to this, reports indicate that Jess had also become pregnant with Peter's child, and was rumored to have been seeking to terminate the pregnancy at the time the murders were taking place. As such, police believe that this boyfriend may have simply snapped under the intense pressure, a combination of his schooling efforts as well as his relationship problems, and ultimately taking out his aggression not only on Jess, but also on her closest friends at the sorority, possibly in a twisted attempt to torture and emotionally damage Jess Bradford as worse as humanly possible. Now, police also recorded phone calls with this suspect wherein he described his own emotional turmoil over Jess's no doubt heavy decision to terminate the pregnancy, which experts and behavioral analysts tend to agree likely contributed to his ultimate mental breakdown in the killings themselves. You've got to think, this is someone whose life is rapidly unraveling around him and who, if the recorded phone calls to the sorority residents reveal, may have already suffered from some aggressive multiple personality disorder. The recent turn of events with the unwanted pregnancy may have in fact proved to be a deadly catalyst into Peter Smythe's own mental collapse, driving him to extreme measures with the murder of those whose deaths he deemed might hurt his intended victim most, that of his romantic partner, Jess Bradford. Peter Smythe was ultimately killed after what investigators assume was some kind of a fatal confrontation with survivor Jess Bradford herself, wherein autopsy reports from an adjacent coroner office in Lincolnville, Ontario, indicate that Smythe succumbed to internal bleeding via extensive blunt force trauma wounds that were discovered by police to be at the hands of a fireplace poker that Jess had armed herself with in self-defense. But there would be a few pieces of crucial evidence that cast some major suspicion on the ultimate police verdict that the sorority Christmas killer was Peter Smythe, and they would prove to be strong enough to indicate that the killer might not have been caught or killed after all. Peter Smythe was physically present at the time of one of the aggressive phone calls made to his girlfriend Jess within the sorority house itself. Now, this was confirmed by Jess's own statements to police in that during the phone call, Peter emerged from the upstairs of the house, claiming that he was taking a nap to get out of the cold outside while he waited for a supposed meeting that they had scheduled to take place in the house. Now, how he gained access to the property is unclear, but the fact that he was physically present at the time of the harassing call from the killer seems to possibly clear him from any kind of suspicion. After all, one might agree that it's pretty difficult to be in two places at once. In addition, reports that lean into Peter's mental collapse as being caused or exasperated by the news of Jess's own potential pregnancy termination are also called into question here. Reports and interviews indicate that Peter didn't actually find out about the pregnancy or the planned abortion until a full day after the disappearance of victim Claire Harrison, and assumingly after the murder of Mac McHenry. Now, this would indicate that if the reports of Smythe being the killer are indeed true, it would mean that he not only murdered at least two of his victims prior to his mental collapse theory taking place, but also that he participated in the numerous harassing and bizarre phone calls before this as well. Now, there are other theories regarding the identity of the sorority Christmas killer, and some are more prominent than others. Now, they include that Peter Smythe used a series of tape recordings in his phone calls, and that he could have easily triggered one of these recordings during the phone calls to the residents, while also appearing physically during the calls themselves. This would no doubt appear to exonerate him from any wrongdoing in the events that he might have been arrested or potentially charged for the crimes therein. In addition, the specific timing of Peter's own appearance at the sorority house during the harassing call that would ultimately eliminate him as a suspect is also called into question as well, as statements may indicate that he actually didn't make himself known until the harassing caller actually hung up, suggesting that he may have in fact made the call from upstairs beforehand and played it off like he was simply napping in the residence. But another prominent theory, and possibly the most popular, is that Peter Smythe was, in fact, not even the sorority Christmas killer at all, and that he instead was an innocent victim of circumstance in the violent events at Pi Kappa Sig in 1974. Now, coupled with the aforementioned evidence that seems to cast a cloud over the depiction of Peter Smythe as the killer, there are actually unconfirmed reports that a male patient may have escaped a local psychiatric facility in the area. Now, this would have been at the same time that the murders took place at the sorority house. Ultimately, little is known about the nature of this patient himself, other than that it's reported he was being held in psychiatric care after the murder of his parents and the apparent attempted murder of his own sister. And if you believe the rumors, his name was none other than Billy, the same name that the killer used in the series of bizarre phone calls to the sorority in 1974. Now, these theories suggest that if the killer was this escaped patient, he may have in fact reiterated parts of prior conversations that Jess Bradford had with the supposed killer Peter Smythe, due to the sheer fact that this Billy character would have been hiding in the attic of the house itself, and as such would have no doubt been privy to any and all conversations taking place within the actual property. Now, this would have included detailed information shared between both Jess and Peter Smythe, such as confidential conversations regarding their pregnancy termination, which would later be used as evidence that implicated Peter Smythe as the killer in the crimes, and would ultimately seem to indicate that Peter Smythe may have actually been falsely accused. Now again, these reports are flimsy and mostly chalked up to local rumors. The official case notes state that the accused murderer in the sorority Christmas killings was none other than Peter Smythe, who had possibly operated as an unknown serial killer for an undisclosed amount of time before suffering a complete mental break, resulting in his own death at the hands of one of his victims. But while police seem firm in their implication of Peter Smythe as the sorority Christmas killer, one has to wonder if the killer wasn't Smythe, and may have in fact been this escaped psychiatric patient simply named as Billy. Could the murderer still be out there? And if so, could any of us be simply one disturbing phone call away from being his next victim on this or any Christmas holiday season? Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Black Christmas. I admittedly had never seen the original 1974 version, having been more familiar instead with the 2006 remake, and I've got to say it was an absolute travesty on my part that it took me so long to get to this movie. I thought Black Christmas, especially for the time, was just amazing, and it's no surprise to me that it became such a horror icon even after debuting to middling reviews at the time. The film really sets a standard for the genre, clearly influencing many of the more popular slashers to follow, including a mostly unseen and ambiguous killer, as well as some incredibly well-written supporting characters, dealing with real-world issues and acting like actual human beings rather than just genre cliches. The movie would go on to spawn 2 remakes, one in 2006 and another in 2019, but in my opinion, both of those totally pale in comparison to the original. Now, for this true crime twist, I did partially borrow from the 2006 version in the origin of the killer, Billy, as in that movie his character gets a full-blown backstory. Spoiler alert for that movie, it's pretty messed up. And since it was apparently based on the character notes from the original director, Bob Clark, I thought it was kind of fair game to include in this coverage, even though in the original 1974 version, the movie surprisingly ends on a totally ambiguous note, with the identity of the killer remaining a mystery to the audience, as he's apparently still inside the house with an unconscious final girl, Jess. It's actually a pretty bold ending that completely took me off guard for the first time through, but in my opinion, it totally holds up, and it adds to the disturbing mystique of the story and of the bizarre killer himself. And that's it for today's episode. Happy holidays to everyone listening, and if you enjoyed this Christmas special, be sure to check out our previous episodes. And while you're at it, hit that like and follow button or equivalent bell notification to get a friendly little reminder of when new episodes release. Spoiler alert, it's every Tuesday. Until next time, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.